All right, let's jump right into a question that, on the surface, seems pretty simple, but is actually one of the most fascinating and complicated puzzles in politics. Who holds the power in the UK? It's a real tug of war, and we're going to unpack it.
So let's get right to it. Who really runs the UK? Is it the Prime Minister in number 10? Is it all the MPs debating in Parliament? Or maybe it's the judges in their robes? The answer? Well, it's not as straightforward as you might think. Let's dig in.
You know, in theory, this should be an easy question to answer. The whole system is designed around a classic model, this kind of perfect power triangle, where everything is supposed to be kept perfectly in balance.
And here it is, the textbook diagram. You've got three distinct parts. First, the legislature. That's just a fancy word for parliament. Their job is to make the laws. Then you've got the executive. That's the government, with the prime minister at the top, and they're the ones who carry out the laws and run the country. And finally, the judiciary, the courts, who are there to interpret the laws and make sure everyone's playing by the rules. Three separate pillars, right? Each one keeping an eye on the other. Looks nice and neat, but the reality is a whole lot messier.
Yeah, because in the real world, those neat lines get incredibly blurry. And for decades, the big debate in British politics has been about whether one of those pillars, the executive, has gotten so big and powerful that it's basically overshadowing everyone else.
In fact, there's a pretty famous and, honestly, a pretty shocking term for this. Way back in 1976, a politician named Lord Hailsham called the UK an elective dictatorship. It's a heck of a phrase, right? What he meant was that once a government wins an election with a good majority, there's very little to stop it from doing whatever it wants until the next election comes around.
So you're probably wondering, how does that even happen? Well, it's kind of baked into the system. First off, the UK's voting system, first past the post, often gives one party a huge majority of seats in Parliament, way more than their share of the actual votes. Then there's intense party discipline. It's really hard for an MP to vote against their own party's government. Plus, the government literally controls the schedule in Parliament. They decide which laws get talked about and when. And finally, the Prime Minister has this power called patronage, which means they can give promotions and cabinet jobs to MPs who are loyal. You put all that together and you get a very, very powerful executive. But hold on. It's not a complete free-for-all for the government. There is another major player in this game, an institution whose entire job is to put the brakes on government power, the judiciary, and at the very top, the Supreme Court.
And here they are. But what's kind of wild is that the Supreme Court, as we know it, is super new. It was only created in 2009. Before that, the top court in the land was actually a bunch of judges who sat in the House of Lords, which is part of Parliament. So creating this separate Supreme Court was a huge deal, a very deliberate attempt to make that separation of powers we talked about look a lot more real. Now, for any of this to work, you need one absolutely critical ingredient: judicial independence. It's the whole foundation. It means judges have to be able to make their rulings based only on the law without being scared that the government will fire them or punish them for a decision they don't like. It's absolutely essential.
And one of their biggest powers, their main tool you could say, is something called judicial review. This is where the courts can look at a decision made by the government and ask one simple question: was this legal? They're not saying if the policy was good or bad, just whether the government actually had the power to do it in the first place.
So, and this is the P, if a court decides the government went too far, it can rule that the action was ultra vires. It's a great Latin phrase, and it literally just means beyond the powers. That ruling can completely stop a government action in its tracks and is a massive check on its power.
So how does a case even get to these guys? Well, it's a long climb up the ladder. Cases usually start in a lower court, then they can be appealed to the Court of Appeal. And finally, if it's a really important legal question that affects the whole country, it can go all the way to the top, the Supreme Court. And whatever they say, goes.
And if you want a perfect, real-world example of this in action, look no further than the famous Gina Miller case in 2017. The Supreme Court told the government, no, you cannot start the Brexit process all by yourself. You need Parliament's permission. That was a huge moment, the judiciary directly telling the executive it had overstepped its bounds.
And hey, speaking of Brexit, we can't possibly talk about who runs the UK without talking about the elephant that was in the room for more than 40 years, the European Union. It was this huge external force that completely changed the power dynamics. Okay, super quick history lesson. The UK first joined what was then basically a trading club, the EEC, back in '73. Over time, that club evolved into the much deeper European Union, and the UK was a member right up until the vote to leave in 2016.
Now, why does all this history matter so much for our power puzzle? Well, it comes down to game-changing court cases like this one, the Factortame case from 1990.
This case established that in some areas, EU law was supreme. It could actually overrule UK law. That was a seismic shift. For the first time, a law passed by the UK's own parliament could be struck down by an outside authority. It completely scrambled the question of who was really in charge.
And this brings us right to the absolute heart of the matter. It's a single concept that explains so much about British politics and the Brexit debate. We're talking about the puzzle of sovereignty.
So what even is sovereignty? Well, if you strip it all down, it's just the ultimate, final authority to make the rules. It's the question of where the buck stops. And in the UK, the traditional answer has always been Parliament. Parliament is sovereign. It can make or unmake any law it wants. But here's the twist. It's not that simple. You've really got to think of sovereignty in two different ways. On the one hand, you have legal sovereignty. That's the theory, the on-paper idea that Parliament is the top dog, no questions asked. But then there's political sovereignty. This is about reality. It's about where power actually is in the real world. A government with a massive majority has huge political sovereignty. We, the people, have it on election day. The theory and the reality can be very different things.
So let's try to answer our big question from the start. Who runs the UK? Well, as you can see, it's complicated. Legally, after Brexit, sovereignty is back with the UK Parliament. But for decades, Parliament itself chose to share that power with the EU. And politically, a ton of power has been handed down to devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The big takeaway is this. Power in the UK isn't a solid thing held by one person. It's more like a fluid, constantly shifting force that flows between the government, Parliament, the courts, and, of course, the people.
And that really leaves us with one final thought. This struggle for power, this constant tug of war, it never really ends. When you think about all the global challenges we face today, from economic crises to international conflicts, the pressure on this system is only going to get more intense. The push and pull for control will keep defining the UK. The only real question is, where will that power shift next?